The rats came first. No one noticed. They always came along the docks, through the grain stores, beneath the floorboards of every city that had ever called itself great. But in the autumn of 1347, the rats were dying in the streets of Messina before anyone thought to ask why. Then the sailors arrived. 12 Genoese trading ships docked in the Sicilian harbor, returning from the Black Sea. The port officials who walked the gangplanks that morning did not find men. They found something else. Bodies blackened at the fingertips, eyes swollen shut, mouths crusted with blood. Those still breathing were not begging for water or mercy. They were begging for death. The harbor master ordered the ships out of port immediately, but it was already too late. Far too late. It had been too late for months. The darkness had already found land. This was not a plague arriving. This was a world ending. To understand what the Black Death took from Europe, you first have to understand what Europe was before it arrived. Not the Europe of textbooks, not dates and dynasties, but the living, breathing, smelling world of the mid-14th century. Medieval Europe was loud. It was chaotic. It was alive in ways that are almost impossible to imagine now. The great cities, Paris, Florence, London, Constantinople, were packed so densely that neighbors shared walls, shared air, shared everything. Market streets ran thick with the smell of tallow candles, animal dung, fresh bread, and open sewage. Church bells marked every hour. Blacksmiths hammered before dawn. Children ran barefoot across cobblestones slick with rainwater and refuse. Merchants argued. Priests chanted. The whole continent hummed with a kind of magnificent, filthy, exhausting energy. The population of Europe had been growing for 3 centuries. Farmland expanded. Cathedrals rose. Universities were founded. Dante wrote. Giotto painted. There was suffering. There was always suffering in the medieval world, but there was also momentum, ambition, a sense that civilization was building towards something. The people who would face the plague did not know they were living in borrowed time. They never do. The disease traveled the ancient trade routes with terrifying patience. It had been burning through Central Asia for years before a single European soul knew its name. Merchants carried it along the Silk Road. Sailors carried it across the Black Sea. Fleas carried it in the fur of rats in the bellies of ships. By the time the first corpses appeared in Sicily, the plague had already crossed 1,000 miles of open water. And then it moved inland. It moved through southern Italy like a fire through dry grass. Catania, Palermo, Naples. Each city trying to close its gates after the infected had already walked through them. Each city learning too late that walls cannot stop what travels on the wind, on the skin, and the blood. The symptoms announced themselves like stages of a sentence being completed. First, the swellings, the buboes, dark, grotesque masses that erupted in the groin, the armpit, the neck. Then the fever that made men tear off their own clothing in January snowfall. Then the black bruising that spread beneath the skin like ink dropped in water, looming outward, unstoppable. Most victims were dead within 5 days. Some were dead within hours of their first symptom. A few, bewilderingly, survived. No one could explain why. Physicians bled their patients. The blood that came out was black. They burned incense. They prescribed figs. They ran. By early 1348, the plague had reached France. By summer, it was in England. By 1349, it was in the frozen north of Scandinavia, killing reindeer herders in villages that had never seen a trading ship. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing to do. There was only waiting. Florence was the heart of Europe's renaissance of thought and commerce. And Florence became the plague's masterpiece of destruction. In the spring of 1348, Giovanni Boccaccio stood in the streets of his city and watched civilization come apart. He would later write about it with the flat, exhausted clarity of a man who had looked into an abyss and crawled back. He described neighbors abandoning neighbors, fathers leaving children in the street, children leaving fathers to die alone in locked rooms because the fear was greater than the love, or because the love was so great they could not bear to watch what was coming. The dead piled faster than the living could bury them. Grave diggers demanded extraordinary wages and then died themselves. Mass graves were opened, enormous pits that monks called a budge, and bodies were stacked in them like timber, layer upon layer, covered with thin soil, opened again the next morning to receive more. The smell settled over Florence like a permanent weather system. It was the smell of the end of something. Inside homes, people burned juniper branches. They drank vinegar. They wore amulets. They prayed in languages and dialects that God, it seemed, had stopped listening to. Some gave up on God entirely. Bands of people moved through dying cities, eating, drinking, taking whatever they wanted from houses whose owners were dead or dying, determined to consume every pleasure before pleasure itself was taken from them. Others turned toward God with an intensity that bordered on madness. Flagellants walking through city squares, beating their own backs with iron-tipped whips, weeping, begging for divine mercy on behalf of a sinful world. And across it all, the silence underneath. The silence of cities that were half empty. The silence of markets with no buyers. The silence of schools with no students, of workshops with no apprentices, of churches with no priests left to ring the bells. That silence was the truest measure of what was happening. Not the death count, the silence. When the worst waves had passed, and they passed in surges, returning again and again across decades. Europe counted its losses and could not count high enough. Between a third and half of the continent's population was gone. Gone. Entire villages simply ceased to exist. Their names disappeared from records. Their fields went unplanted, went wild, went back to forest. You can still find them today. Medieval ghost settlements in England and France and Germany, detectable only as subtle ridges in a farmer's field, barely visible from the air, invisible from the ground. The plague did not simply kill people. It killed the world those people had built. It collapsed the feudal order that had organized European society for centuries. When half the peasant workforce was dead, the surviving half could suddenly demand wages. Lords who had kept serfs for generations found themselves bargaining. The Black Death catastrophically, accidentally, fatally disrupted the most rigid social hierarchy in Western history and planted seeds of a labor movement that would eventually reshape civilization. The church, which had promised intercession and delivered none, lost something it would never fully recover. Authority, certainty, the unquestioned assumption that God's representatives on earth understood God's intentions. When your bishop dies of the same disease as your servant, something fundamental shifts in how you understand power. Art changed. Architecture changed. The way Europeans thought about death, about time, about the body, all of it shifted in the decades after the plague's worst devastation. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the defining artistic motifs of the late medieval period. Skeletons in crowns, skeletons in vestments, death taking the hand of every rank and station equally, indifferently, without exception. It was a traumatized civilization's attempt to process the lesson that the plague had taught so brutally, that no human structure, no title, no prayer, no wall is permanent. There is something humbling about standing at the edge of an event like this and looking back across 7 centuries. These were people who went asleep in a world they understood and woke up in one they did not recognize. They did not have the comfort of hindsight. They did not know the plague would eventually pass. They did not know that out of the wreckage, something extraordinary would eventually come. A renaissance, a reformation, a questioning of authority that would eventually lead in fitful, painful steps toward modernity. They only knew what was in front of them, the swelling, the fever, the silence, and yet they endured. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough to bury the dead and reopen the markets and rebuild the walls and light the candles in empty churches and keep going. Not because they were exceptional, because they were human, and humans, given any possibility of continuing, almost always do. The Black Death did not end the world. It felt like it would. It looked like it would. For the people living inside that darkness, there was no way to know the difference. There never is. History is not a thing that happened to other people in another time. It is the accumulated weight of every choice, every catastrophe, every silence, every survival that made the present moment possible. The people who endured the plague could not have imagined you, but in some quiet, unreachable way, they built the ground you were standing on. Remember them. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of what ordinary people carried in extraordinary times, there are more stories here waiting to be told. Stories that deserve to be heard. Subscribe, and we will tell them together. Because history does not disappear. It waits.